a majority minority.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. A majority minority district, and very strong African-American presence, Asian presence, Caucasian presence, a lot of very interesting neighborhoods, Rainier Beach High School, Cleveland High School, Garfield High School, etc. So it's a very sort of vibrant, interesting, diverse district. It is in many places lower income, so there's a lot of challenges regarding affordable housing, homelessness, etc. So,
wow, that's a lot going on there, huh? Can you tell us what got you to run? What made you decide, like, you know what, I need to run for office, and what's kind of your plans in doing that?
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously we live in very momentous times defined by a number of concurrent crises that I don't have to enumerate. And in my view, these require, they represent an opportunity for a structural response rather than just an incremental response. So the way we shouldn't go about things, shouldn't be going about things, in my opinion, is let's tweak this, let's try to get through the crisis of the pandemic and sort of get back to normal, but instead it represents some important opportunities to restructure society. And in my opinion, candidly, the incumbent isn't addressing these things. So I'll just list a couple. One is climate change. I mean, this is obviously an imminent threat, an existential threat, and this needs to be addressed aggressively. The incumbent that I'm running against isn't even sponsoring the most significant, important bills in this area. So I feel like that's an area that's not being addressed. We all know that we have the most regressive tax structure in the entire country, where our lowest 20% income residents pay 17.8% of their income in state and local taxes, whereas our richest 1% pay 3%. So that's exactly backwards of what it should be. And that's especially problematic in my district because we have a lot of lower income individuals. And if you take a person earning minimum wage, that's $30,000 a year. They're paying 17.8% of their income in state and local taxes. The national average is about 11%. The difference between those translates into $2,000 per year in extra state and local taxes that everyone who's lower income in my district is paying relative to what they should be paying. Again, the incumbent's been in office for 22 years. When she started, there was no major progressive tax, and there still isn't. So that needs to be addressed. I favor a capital gains tax, amongst other things. I sort of like the Frank Chop proposal. Perhaps we'll have a chance to get into that. I think not pursuing an austerity budget is essential for the 2021 state legislative session, and that's very feasible through a combination of tapping into the rainy day fund, a new tax increase, and a hiring freeze. And then I guess the final issue that I'll bring up is that of racial justice. There's a lot of focus on police restructuring, and I support that. There's a lot of focus on criminal justice reform, and I support many things in both of these areas. What there hasn't been enough of, in my opinion, is enough focus on underlying inequities that give rise to a lot of these problems in the first place. So I'm an educator. I work for Mercer Island High School. Prior to that, I worked for 15 years as a substitute teacher for Seattle schools. There's about 100 schools in the district, and I've worked in every single one of them. And the inequities, of course, are massive, and they're based on socioeconomics. And so, for example, 83% of the Black students, I think it's 8th grade males that I'm citing, in Seattle Public Schools are on free and reduced lunch programs, and the figure for white students is 9%. And as long as we have those kinds of glaring, enormous inequities, we're going to in turn have all sorts of other problems that relate to policing. So I won't go into the details on it, but I support what I'm calling a concept of community investment schools, where when a school reaches a certain level of free and reduced lunch price students, it triggers an increase in per pupil funding at those schools and a decrease in per pupil funding at more affluent schools. and the funding would go to higher compensation levels for teachers and administrators, lower class sizes, more wraparound services, and the introduction of advanced placement and international baccalaureate and/or international baccalaureate programs. But the broader point is it would be a societal means of saying we're not going to tolerate year in, year out, these massive inequities in education that lead to differences in SAT scores and education opportunities, and hence just serve to perpetrate, the injustices that we all see. So those are 4 areas. Those are sort of the planks of my campaign that all represent a means to engage in structural reform of our society, and engaging in that is why I'm interested in serving in Olympia. So.
Excellent, thank you. A lot of those that you mentioned, and the reason why we have so many problems today stems from anti-corruption, corruption in our government, and the need for election reform, and of course, big money, taking over our politics. So a big thing that we're about, our revolution, Washington Bernicrats Coalition, is we work on the American Anti-Corruption Act. We're trying to get the voices back to the people, and election reform. So like things like ranked choice voting, or like a star voting system, and also watching where the money's coming from. We do believe that when big corporations are bringing big money to campaigns, that they tend to represent them and not the people. So what is your take kind of on what I just talked about, and how are you fundraising? How are your funds coming in? Have you taken any big PAC money, and if so, what types of PACs, etc.?
Okay, so maybe I'll answer your question in reverse order. So no, I've taken the fossil fuel pledge. I've taken the no austerity budget pledge. I've taken the Green New Deal pledge, and my policy for donations is I accept donations only from individuals and small businesses. So I don't accept contributions. Not only do I not accept them from PACs, but I also don't accept them from large businesses. So it's basically neighborhood businesses and individuals. And with respect to your broader point about corruption, certainly this is a foundational issue in our democracy. So we have ever increasing income inequality. We have the Trump tax breaks, which gives, tax breaks to corporations, which is more problematic. We have the Citizens United decision, which is deplorable. We have a similar decision in the individual area, McCutcheon, which relaxes some constraints on individual contributions. So all of that's very concerning. We then have a lot of activity on the voting rights front, which is problematic. The partial repeal of part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which allows Southern states to not report on their progress to ensure voting rights. We have voting stations closing, the ongoing purge of voter rolls. And all of this works together in a very nefarious way, whereas, as you say, corporations and affluent individuals get more and more influence into the process, and individuals less and less. And it's alarming. And one of the things, one of the corollaries of that is that candidates then feel more pressure to spend more of their time fundraising, more of their time catering to special interests and corporate interests, which in turn leads to a diminishment in the integrity of the candidates, in the quality of the dialogue, in the agendas of candidates. And so sort of the confluence of these various factors is, of course, leading to a very powerful and troubling denigration of sort of the overall quality of the democracy. So these are all huge issues in the country right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right. Well, let Jason come in with the question now that I took up a good chunk of this piece. Go ahead, Jason.
No, I was a high school math teacher for 18 years. I certainly appreciate your perspective on the education system. I really like everything that you have talked about so far. Very happy that you have taken your position on your campaign financing the way I have, and I know as a candidate myself for federal Congress trying to do the same thing. It is difficult to be competitive when you are holding on to your principles. And so I applaud you for that. Couple of specific things. Where do you stand on state bank proposal? I'm assuming you're aware of Bob Hasagawa's
Sure.
long-standing state bank proposal. Talk about that.
Yeah, so I know Bob, and I've attended forums where he's discussed the state bank, and I support it. And I support it for a couple of different reasons. Yes, it's great for infrastructure development. Yes, it's good from the perspective of maintaining, keeping interest income in the state rather than having it go to out-of-state banks, et cetera. But it's also, it can also be used for creative things such as funding Green New Deal programs. It can also, as such, help in the economic recovery by supporting Green New Deal projects that will provide infrastructure jobs, sort of a Keynesian job stimulus. It can also be used for student loans. So there's many facets to it that are sometimes not fully appreciated. So I support the state bank. I hope it gets implemented. We'll see how that goes. It is challenging. Excuse me, I should have addressed that. And I'll say one other thing about this is that the upcoming carbon tax proposal from Carbon Law basically takes carbon taxes in the future, securitizes them so that the money can be brought forward to the present. And one variant of their proposal is to consider possibly using some of that funding to play a role in launching a state bank. So I think that would be a very creative way to combine carbon taxes coupled with getting a state bank started. So I am supportive of it.
Excellent.
I will mention the obvious, that given that this is only up and running in one state, North Dakota, that does make it politically challenging to generate the votes necessary to bring it into effect. But nevertheless, I support it. So
Gotta keep fighting for those things, even if they're not popular now when they're visionary. So another thing, how familiar are you with Whole Washington?
I'm familiar with Whole Washington, and I have signed their pledge, and I'm or very much in favor of single payer healthcare. So that's something that I would like to see. Perhaps I'll make a couple comments on that as well. And it's not intended to be a caveat. I feel like universal single payer healthcare is the right vision for the country. And so I'm strongly and unequivocally in support of it. I will say two things. It would be, in my opinion, certainly preferable for that to happen at the national level rather than at a state level. But if it can't happen at the national level, obviously it's not going to happen under this administration, but there might be able to be progress made in the next administration if it's Democratic. But if it can't be done at the national level, I still certainly support it at the state level. And there are, of course, complexities with trying to affect these. Everyone is familiar with the fact that a single payer system is controversial from the perspective of insurers because they'll be, put out of business. So that's an obvious dimension. But what is sometimes, I think, a little bit less appreciated is that it's also challenging even within liberal constituencies, because the existing healthcare system will create winners and losers. And some of the winners will be, let's just say, for example, unions that have developed very, sort of generous healthcare benefits for their members, even though they might, from an ideological standpoint, favor single healthcare. They may still want to hold on to what they've been able to negotiate. So we've seen some of these complexities.
And unfortunately, as being a teacher and being in the union, and I know what a good healthcare package is. I'm not unionized anymore, and I know what being on the current ACA options in Washington State are like. It's a frustration for me that the union mentality is supposed to uplift all boats, and yet you do find people who have good union packages who are resisting this and not thinking about, union membership is quite frankly a very small percentage of our workforce. And what we're really trying to do with Whole Washington, because I'm a board member, by the way, is we are trying to make sure everybody has the same coverage. That, I mean, the whole idea behind a union is that you're fighting for everybody's rights.
Yeah.
So I get a little bit frustrated with that resistance. And the nice thing about Whole Washington is, in the end, what you would get out of a Whole Washington system is really very comparable to what good union packages would be. And so we're trying to get everybody to realize that all people have a right to that. So I'm glad to hear that. Certainly national Medicare for all would be the gold standard. But barring that, we want to do what we can in here. I'm gonna ask a fairly pointed question here, and it's something that I came across myself as a candidate, and I think in your case, it's probably something that you have come up with, and this is the issue of identity politics. Obviously, you're a white man, you're running against a woman of color who is fairly respected in the community, and I totally agree with everything that you have said about the push for progressive policy, and I want to have leaders who are supporting policy first. Where are you in your community with feedback on you as a white man challenging a woman of color for this seat? What have you come across?
Yeah, so that's a very insightful question, and I guess I'll answer it in two ways. One is I do have, in my opinion, reasonable credibility in this front. I'm on the board of the 37th District Democrats. That's a very racially diverse membership, and I hold 2 board positions now. I've been on the board for 5 years. I make presentations on the proceedings in the state legislature each year for the district, so I have credibility there. The fact that I worked 15 years full-time as a substitute teacher in Seattle, including on prolonged assignments for Rainier Beach, Cleveland, Franklin, where they hired me to work for a full year to replace somebody or to fill a position where they hadn't hired somebody yet. So I have experience there. I also work on several climate change advocacy organizations. I'm a member of the 37th Legislative District Environment and Climate Caucus. I'm on the steering committee for the South Seattle Climate Action Network, and I'm the treasurer for the Environment and Climate Caucus of the Washington State Democratic Party. 2 of those organizations have endorsed me. The third actually doesn't do endorsements. So
that's where I know your name from. Okay, you've been on the. I've sent you money because I've been a member of the Environment and ECC in the past. So now I recognize your name. Okay.
Okay. So there's areas where I have credibility. That's a good thing. I was a treasurer for an organization called Arts in Motion, which is no longer in business, but which was a nonprofit that provided subsidized music lessons to students in South Seattle. So I think there's a number of areas where I've established credibility, and I'm seen as, I think I'm far more progressive in my views than my opponent, for example. One thing I haven't brought up, but in 2015, she supported legislation to relax restrictions on payday lenders to enable them to make more loans into a lower socioeconomic district, which I find very problematic. So I have credibility. Now, all that being said, I have still confronted some instances where what you're referring to has been brought up. There are some people that have expressed their sentiment that perhaps I shouldn't be challenging, a woman of color in my district. It is the case that everyone that serves in Olympia from the 37th Legislative District is a member of a minority group, okay? And some people have gone so far as to say, it's going to be challenging for any Caucasian to serve anytime soon. I don't know if that's true. My campaign is about substance, and my view is, on the one hand, I'm fully supportive of diversity in the legislature. So I think it's great that there's all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds running. I'm supportive of all of that. At the same time, I'm not going to not run just because I'm Caucasian. So So I guess the short answer is I have run into some of that, but I do feel like I have a reasonable level of credibility in my district in those areas as well. So
I completely understand and totally support that position. My last question is just who have you got backing you right now? Who would throw some names out who are in your corner supporting this?
Okay, so my primary endorsements, I have 350 Seattle. I mentioned the Environment and Climate Caucus of the Washington State Democratic Party, 37th District Environment and Climate Caucus, Grandmothers Against Gun Violence, Humane Voters of Washington. You brought up ranked choice voting, which I support. Fair Vote Washington and ranked choice voting. Those are the ones that come to mind. I think I have sort of 8 major endorsements of my campaign, and they're all listed on my website. So
that's fantastic.
Those are the key ones, yeah.
But clearly the House Democratic Campaign Committee is going to be behind Santos.
That's correct. Once you obtain the endorsement of the 37 Democrats, which she did, then that locks in the King County Democrats, and it sort of locks in the Democratic Party machinery, so to speak, behind her. So.
I'm up in Snohomish County. I totally understand how it works. I appreciate your forthrightness with those questions. I do like the things that you're talking about. My personal opinion here is that you'd be a great representative for the district. I'll pass it over to Sharon now.
Hi, Sharon.
Hello. Sorry for jumping on late there.
You're all good.
Yeah. I've just been appreciating this Q&A, and just to say that I was very happy to vote for John for John's endorsement by the Environment and Climate Caucus of the Washington State Democrats. Very strong candidate. So I'm very happy that you have the endorsements that you do have, and I definitely appreciate how difficult it is to run against anybody who has the full backing of the party. It's very, very makes it very difficult, but I really appreciate you doing it, because we need to keep progressive ideas in the conversation as much as possible. And I wish that in the 40th LD, I wish we had, actually not the 40th LD, but the 2nd Congressional District, I wish we had the opportunity to have 2 Democrats. We came close.
We are missing out on a lot of important conversations because that didn't happen, but that's the way it goes.
Yes, and I brought that up in a meeting the other day. Anyway, John, one of my big concerns is why, after all these years of talking about the need to transition off of fossil fuels, and in my opinion, the need to transition out of this huge dependence that our state has on military activity and the defense industry, why haven't we been able to get any just transition programs up and going? I mean, the concept of just transition has been out there for a very long, I'm going to say since the 70s, really. So to me, that seems like a very long time. And I first became aware of it working with the trade unions internationally at the UN back in 1998. So the term has been getting out there more and more into the public, which I'm very happy about. Just transition, what that means, and the social justice, environmental justice aspect of that, and the labor aspect of that, how to ensure that people who are working and depending on communities where these jobs exist do not fall through the crack during a transition away from fossil fuels and away from military activity. Now, I was fortunate to be able to have a resolution passed by the Washington State Democrats just a few weeks ago that makes the case for curtailing U.S. military activity in a significant way in response to the climate crisis. So we are going to, if we can even get action on that, which is hard because our elected officials tend to ignore the platform. So one thing we need to do is make the platform matter. And another thing is, how are we going to make that a reality? So more people we can have in office that really believe that these ideas are practical and that they can be brought to fruition, the better. So I'm actually giving a speech rather than asking you a question. So I
Yeah, but
apologize for that.
yeah, I understand your question, and let me, perhaps I'll make a couple comments. Um, the just transition is very important, not just from a substantive standpoint, which is of course the most important issue, but it's also important from an implementation standpoint. And what I mean by that is the climate change movement does have a bit of a tendency to create a divide within liberal circles between, you know, people that think it's sort of an elite cause or or a cause espoused by the very people that caused the problem in the first place. So there can become sort of this labor versus environmentalist or blue-green divide. And the just transition should be the mechanism by which those can be bridged. So that's one point I'll make. A second and related point, we also have an Eastern Washington, Western Washington divide over climate change, but with wildfires and irrigation issues, land use issues, there should be opportunity to bridge those gaps as well. And those need to be pursued aggressively so that we become united. There's nothing more frustrating than working in climate change advocacy and then watching liberals go at each other and not make requisite change. We saw that in the carbon law versus the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy debate, et cetera, and it sort of recurs. So this is a critical area. There is the HEAL Act in Olympia, which has not passed, Healthy Environments for All. Rebecca Saldana, our state senator, the lead sponsor. That's very powerful legislation that creates a framework for emphasizing the just transition in all climate change legislation that's passed. So I strongly support that. And then just being a little bit broad, I think we need to be cognizant of the fact that in the upcoming legislative session, there's a big risk that climate change could move too much to the back burner, so to speak, because there's going to be this focus on the pandemic, the recession, the pending $4.2 billion revenue shortfall, et cetera. So what I've been advocating for are high impact, low cost proposals on climate change. And those include the HEAL Act, which I just talked about. It also includes banning the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030, the Clean Fuels Program, and also a mandatory K-12 climate education in schools statewide. That's probably the one that's most meaningful to me, because we can work as activists, which is great, but there can't be anything better than having 1.4 million school children learning about the science of climate change every year. And a very momentous bill was just passed in New Jersey, the first in the country, maybe 3 months ago, calling in New Jersey for a formal curriculum, multidisciplinary every year. And that should serve as the template for us to follow. So we do have to keep that. Yeah,
it's amazing that we're just getting to that now. I've been teaching about climate change for 20 years. There were people doing it before I did.
And as a teacher, I mean, it's alarming. You know, all of my years in Seattle schools, I worked in a lot of classes where that could have been taught and wasn't. And even at Mercer Island High School, which is a great school, very pleased to be working there, but climate is taught on a ad hoc basis. It's not structured. And, you know, one of my social studies teachers recently said, if we're not here to teach this, why are we here? And that sort of captures my sentiments also. And it also sends a bad implicit message to students if they're aware that there's this sort of, you know, imminent epic threat, and yet it's not really part of their structured curriculum. It sends sort of an odd, troubling implicit message. So that needs to become a more front and centered. But anyway, I think, you know, broadly, we need to be very focused on keeping these practical, high impact programs front and center in the upcoming legislative session.
Yeah, two things I just want to mention in response to that. One thing is, how can we use this pandemic as an opportunity to say, where can we create jobs, since so many people have lost their jobs? We still have a lot, even in our state, which is better than a lot of other states, but we still have a lot that can be done in energy efficiency retrofitting of buildings throughout the state. That's huge.
That's
one thing,
and
but that's a big thing.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that before you joined us, we talked about the the value of a state bank and how a state bank can be used to fund Green New Deal programs. But that also touches on another important and potentially troubling dimension of upcoming legislative decisions, and that's transit. Because transit, of course, is being decimated by the pandemic. They're not collecting fares, tax revenues down, ridership's down for all sorts of obvious reasons. And so there are already calls for defunding transit or reducing funding, and that's very, very problematic because transit is a pillar for the climate change efforts going forward in all its forms, transit-oriented development, et cetera. So that's another area. My view is we need to push to maintain transit funding. It's not realistic to think that it's going to increase now, but if we can hold the line on it till the pandemic is under control and transit ridership builds up, but we can't afford a big dip there either. So.
Right, I agree. That's something we really need to keep bolstered up. And I'm very interested in creative ways that we can keep that going. Creative means of funding, since we are kind of inhibited in our state from funding things for the public good. One other thing I wanted to mention to you, because you were talking about the climate change curriculum, is over this last several months, I've been working with some students on Whidbey Island. Now, I live on Orcas Island, but I've been doing this remotely, and I'm also interested because we have educators here on Orcas Island and students that are interested in this as well in our environmental club at the high school here. But there's a group on Whidbey Island that has formed they just celebrated a year, by the way. They've just been active for a year now. They're called United Student Leaders. And these are middle and high school kids that are so passionate about action on climate change and environmental justice, social justice, and just really, they're very, very smart. They're very articulate. They're very caring. And they've been actually hosting some webinars. And I would just love for them to be among the leaders in bringing a climate change curriculum to schools in Washington State. And I'll be very happy to put you in touch with them.
Okay, and I would welcome that. And you can, if you can give them my contact information or share with me how, a way I could get in touch with them. That would be good. And I will say also, returning to this notion of climate change, I think I said there were 5 bills that I support, and I mentioned 4. There is a bill that was introduced last year in Washington State to introduce climate change into the curriculum. It's not as vast by any means as the New Jersey bill, but it would at least be a step in the right direction. And I will point out that my opponent wasn't a sponsor of the bill, even though she sits on the she's the chair of the House Education Commission. So I found that a bit troubling. The other thing that's that it needs to be underscored, with youth making demands about climate change progress, not only is that very inspiring, but it also points out the intergenerational compact that we're violating with our youth, right? The older generations get to live a lifestyle that's sort of irresponsible, and then they pass that problem onto youth. So the lawsuits and youth involvement it's important, and it's also very poignant. It demonstrates one of the underlying problems with the whole issue. So.
Yeah, and a big part of that I see is a lack of leadership, both on the state level, but of course on the national level. And it's very, very hard to change our lifestyle without good leadership.
Yeah.
So,
and you talked about the linkages between the pandemic and climate change. And, of all the negative things of the current federal administration, and there are many, 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 but one of them that it does get a lot of attention, but it even deserves to get more attention is the perils of denigrating science and the perils of denigrating a reliance on fact and a denigration of logic, and this notion that you can just wake up and say, here's my opinion on climate change based on nothing. It's dangerous and it's irresponsible. So coming back to the pandemic, I mean, I'm certainly not inclined to wish people poorly. But one can hope that with the current number of people in the administration contracting COVID-19, which is certainly unfortunate, but hopefully a corollary benefit will be to start to demonstrate, nobody's bigger than science. That applies to the pandemic, but it also applies to climate change. I mean, when you have 97 or 98% of the world's climate scientists saying this is anthropogenic, it needs a policy response, it's time sensitive, we should be far past the point at which there's any debate. The only debate should be on which specific solutions and which sequencing is appropriate. There should be no more talk about, I don't believe it, and so on and so forth. So I'm hoping that there will be some, residual positive impact from the current COVID flare-up on this notion that you don't have to take science seriously.
Yeah,
Well,
and that curriculum, one more, I'm sorry, just one more.
Go ahead, Sharon. Sorry.
One more thing about the importance of curriculum is for people to learn and understand that despite some assertions, climate change wasn't invented by Al Gore. It wasn't invented by China. It was the climate change science, the science of global warming, was first studied back in the 1820s in France. And there's a whole history of climate change science that should be studied.
Mm-hmm.
There should at least be an awareness of it.
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree. Thank you.
I was going to follow up with what you said there, John, in that very sadly, and this is something that puts me personally at odds with many Democrats, is that no, the science is inarguable. Now the reality is you're being bought off by your corporate ownership to prevent actual meaningful solutions. Incrementalism on climate change is going to kill us also. It's just maybe going to kill us a little slower. So I do appreciate the things that you have said there. You brought up, I want to go back to the transit thing, because transportation is such a huge problem. And here in Western Washington, I live in Marysville, which is the north end of the, what has been deemed in years past the worst traffic in the nation, in the I-5 corridor that runs from Linwood to where I am in Marysville. We have tons of cars on the road. They're sitting in standstill traffic. And one of the things that came out of the pandemic is that I could see, a month after cars were off the road, that our skies were noticeably cleaner. So here in Western Washington, I moved to Washington State in 1983, and I have seen, I could look from Seattle out to the Cascades in the east, and it was just crystal blue skies. And I have seen over the last 35 years of living in this state, that skyline get gradually dingier and dingier, to where we do have we've got that haze on the skyline. And we saw that go away just by taking cars off the road. And so transit has, getting efficient green mass transit to get cars off the road is vital. And you see over my shoulder the tax big business sign. I appreciate all of Shama Sawant's efforts on the Seattle City Council to get Amazon taxed. Where do you stand? You talked about capital gains tax. Where do you stand on a straight up income tax, wealth tax? Because these transit projects, it's not that the money doesn't exist to fund these projects. It's that we are refusing to tax the people who could afford these projects. Where do you stand on those efforts for just simply taking the money from the people who have it and saying, this is what our society needs? And then the other question I wanted to ask was about what committees in the House would you see yourself being best equipped to serve on? Okay,
so maybe I'll address the last question first, just because it's front of mind. Education Committee, Ways and Means, and Environment. So those are the, climate change is the main source of my activism work, and I would certainly like to be involved in decisions there. I feel like my education background positions me well to work in that field. I didn't mention my first career. I worked as a management consultant for a little over a decade for a firm in Washington, D.C., and I have, as a function of that, I have what I consider to be a pretty good grounding in economics, finance. I became a partner at the firm. We worked for large businesses. So, my background sort of reflects the committees that I would like to serve on. With respect to financing, we've talked about the fact that we definitely need more progressive taxation in the state. And so at the state level, I sort of, at this point, am supporting Frank Chop's three-prong proposal, which is a capital gains tax, number one, a tax on high income earners, number two, and then a payroll tax to fund a variety of things, including affordable housing, et cetera. But it's three prongs, all leaning to various degrees progressive, and that will do a couple things. One is it will help address the state budget pending budget deficit, the $4.2 billion revenue shortfall, without resorting to austerity. So that's huge. And then concurrently, adding progressivity to the state's tax structure, which is huge, and also allowing financing for some of the things that we're talking about, including transit. At the city level, I also support the Jumpstart Seattle program, which is the taxation again on high income earners. So I'm 100% in favor, in Washington State in particular, because we're so regressive in affecting tax legislation that starts to rectify that situation. And it bespeaks to a broader issue, which is we're seen as so progressive. If you went to, let's just say, Tennessee and said, what's your views about Washington? Everyone would say, oh, it's a very progressive liberal state. But in reality, on issues ranging from gun control, K-12 finance, taxation, it's nowhere near as progressive as it needs to be.
Absolutely correct. And this is one of the things that I said when I was on the stump trying to get on the ballot for here in Congressional District 2. We've got 7 Democrats representing us in Congress, and we only have a single one that supports single payer healthcare. We only have Pramila is a relative gem when it comes to progressive policy, and none of the other representatives even come close to supporting the policies that we need at the federal level. So I really think that we need to have a big paradigm shift in our federal and state representation here in Washington if we are going to truly earn the progressive credibility that other people in the country seem to think that we have. So you're absolutely right about that, and I appreciate you saying it.
Yeah. If I may, I might even add the following comment about the progressive movement. Let's say 90% of public policy issues, certainly intelligent people can disagree on various positions and so on and so forth. But I will argue that at least for the pillars of the progressive movement, I think it's hard to argue in some of these key areas that there really are two credible sides left. So we've talked about climate change. When it's 98% to 2%, do we really have two credible camps, or are we just down to one? And I'll certainly argue the latter. For tax reform, are there really two credible camps on Washington state taxation? Either we should be 50th in the country, or we should be better than that. I mean, so on a number of these things, I feel like it's become quite clear, universal health care, every advanced country in the world has it except for us. So again, yes, there's different ways to achieve universal health care. But I guess my point is, on some of these, the evidence is becoming overwhelming that the progressive view is the appropriate view to pursue in public policy. So.
Excellent. You good, Jason? Sharon? Okay. I was actually going to make sure we did hit that point by the end here, because you mentioned it at the top of the hour. So thank you for going more in depth with that. Right now, I'd like to give you an opportunity to hit on anything that we may not have touched on that you want to make sure your constituents will need to know about you. And then also where we can find you out there, and how people can help.
Okay, great. So I'll just say a couple things. One is I do feel like I have a very broad background. I've had a career in the consulting profession on the East Coast. I've had a career for whatever it is now, approaching 20 years as an educator. I am from this area. I'm involved in climate change advocacy. I've written 40 articles, or more than 40 articles, that have been published in the South Seattle Emerald on issues of public policy. I'm on the board of the 37th District Democrats, et cetera. So I feel like I have a broad, I have a undergraduate degree. I have 2 master's degrees, one in teaching and one in history. I feel like I have a broad background and a broad level of involvement that would serve me very well in Olympia. I've underscored, and I will again, that climate change is the primary source of my civic activism, and I'm very proud about that. I feel like it's just essential to have that be front and center at all time. So I do want to underscore that. I also consider myself a very substantive candidate, informed, aware, I read a lot, follow events, participate in a lot, and I feel like as a result of that, I have a very sort of substantive orientation to policy, which I believe our Washington State and our society at large very much needs. Move away from ideological tropes and into actual substance. And I'm also a very progressive candidate. We've talked about that. I consider myself far more progressive than my opponent. So I feel like that is much needed in Olympia as well. So those are just some points about my candidacy that I wanted to emphasize. My website is campaign website, staffordforstaterepresentative.org. I do have some recordings of substantive Saturdays with Stafford sessions I used earlier in the campaign to connect with constituents during the pandemic. Those are all online. I have my endorsements online. I have my policy positions online. I'm very transparent and very direct. I also have a presence on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. And to help, there's 2 ways, and these are available on my volunteer tab. I am, and they take about 15 seconds to sign up for. One is to be a word of mouth volunteer. So you click a box, provide your address, and within a day you'll have a sign, you'll have campaign flyers, and you'll have campaign buttons delivered to your doorstep. So we have a number of people working on that. We're not engaged in formal doorbelling sessions right now as a function of the pandemic, but people use the flyers in different ways. Some people do go door to door. Some people pass them out, at retail outlets, et cetera. And then the second is what I refer to as a social media volunteer. So you sign up, and it's as simple as providing your email, and every about 10 days you get a newsletter from me, short, 1 page, that describes an issue: Public Records Act, climate change, payday lending, where I'm differentiated from my opponent, and you can just learn and then share it with constituents as you see fit. So there are no strings attached, very simple. Even if you don't have a lot of time to spend on things, a lot of people say they just appreciate them from the informative standpoint. So those are the ways to get involved in my campaign. Right now, we have a lot of volunteers, and welcome more. So.
Thank you very, very much. And thank you for taking your time out today to meet with us. And thank you for stepping up and running. Sharon, yeah. I think I see your hand.
I don't know whether we mentioned this or not. We do very much need to be sensitive to and deal with Black Lives Matter, the policing issue. I don't know if that came up in this discussion.
Yeah, just a tad.
Yeah, it did. Maybe I'll just, very briefly address that. We talked before. I said I don't support literal defunding of the police. I also don't support random figures like a 50% defunding, but I do support police restructuring. And in the process of doing that, that will presumably release funds to be invested into community programs. So I support the process, but it needs to be substantive and analytical. And probably the most promising vector from which to approach that is analysis of 911 calls to see how many of these really demand a first response from the police, how many can be dealt with through mental health or social workers or paramedics. And that process, which is underway, will yield the possibility of police force reductions. And I also favor a whole host of reforms, banning chokeholds, taking police officers out of the schools, banning the transfer of military technology from the federal government to police departments, de-escalation training, anti-bias training, intervention training. So there's a whole host of reforms that I support, but it does need to be analytical, not just capricious. Similarly, in criminal justice reforms, there need to be more emphasis on diversion courts to keep people out of the criminal justice system in the first place. For people that do go into the criminal justice system, it needs to be more of a focus on rehabilitation programs, re-entry, work release. I am opposed to the private ownership of prisons and detention centers. The restoration of felony voting rights is important. Getting rid of things like 3 strikes and the death penalty and enhanced sentences, all of which are heavily biased towards minority communities. All of those things need to happen, and there's tremendous potential there. So I support all of that, but as I say, it should be analytical. And then the other point that I emphasized before you came on the call is, in addition to police restructuring and criminal justice reforms, there needs to be a focus at the underlying inequities that give rise to many of these problems. And we talked about the fact that Seattle Schools has the 5th biggest achievement gap of any school district in the country, and has for years. So if we're not getting at those kinds of things, we're going to continue to see other inequities in policing and criminal justice. So yes, they need to be dealt with at that level, but also the underlying level. And I did talk about a specific proposal I had on community investment schools. I won't go into it again, but I do have a proposal there to raise per pupil funding in schools with a high percentage of kids on free and reduced lunch programs. So.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. And making sure that gets in there, Sharon. I appreciate that. All right. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in. And we will see you next time. Say goodbye.
Yeah. Appreciate the substantive discussion, John. Thank you.
I do too. I appreciate the substantive questions. Thank you very much. So.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So it's recording. So what happened is, I'm not sure, there was something happened on the back end. I wasn't able to stream it, but I'm going to upload it out there. It's being recorded to my computer. But that first piece, when I just brought you in, we talked about your district. Do you mind just running through that again? Because what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to just take it from the end here, put it at the beginning, and it'll all look all magical, like nothing.
You guys,
happened.
I'm going to sign off if that's okay.
Yeah, you're great. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you so much. Have a great one. And I will share the video.
Okay, yeah, once I get it up there, I'll share it. Yeah, thank you. All right, so I'll just start again. I'll welcome, and then we'll just do that piece, and then we'll be good. So thank you for dealing with me on that. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Rhonda Walker, Our Revolution, Washington Bernie-Crat's chair. Today joining us, we are interviewing John Stafford. He is running for state representative in Legislative District 37. Welcome, John.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
So I'd like you to tell us about your district, kind of, how it's outlined, and then the people within it. Can you kind of go into what your district is made of?
Yeah, I can. So the 37th Legislative District is in South Seattle, and it's a long north-south rectangular district. And in the northern side, its boundaries are basically Madison Park and Pioneer Square. And then it runs along Lake Washington, which is the border on the east. And on the west, the border is Beacon Avenue, loosely speaking. So it's a long north-south swath, and it goes down, and it actually includes part of Renton. And it also includes Skyway West Hill, which is unincorporated area. So the fact that there's Seattle, Renton, Skyway West Hill creates a lot of variety from that perspective. And moving on to demographics, it's a very, very demographically diverse district. It's often referred to as the most diverse district in the state of Washington. It's a majority minority district, a very considerable Black population, Asian population, white population, Hispanic population. And so there's just a lot of variety. It is the home to Rainier Beach High School, Cleveland High School, Garfield High School, Franklin High School, etc. So from multiple perspectives, it's a very diverse district with a lot of variety. And for all those reasons, I actually think it's a fascinating district, and I love living in the 37th district. I've lived in a couple different locations within it. I've lived here for 20 years. And it's also a lower socioeconomic district in many places, which creates a whole host of challenges. So a very interesting district, very diverse district, and a district with very pronounced challenges that, of course, need to be addressed in Olympia. So.